Hello, welcome to a video that I've been looking forward to making for a very long time. Today we're going to be addressing unit collision in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I've been playing D&D for something like 25 years, and in that time I've developed a few strategies that I think are worth sharing. This originally came up a few years ago, when a player asked me, what happens when one creature falls on another creature? The official rulebooks are all silent, as far as I can tell. If you can point me to a passage saying otherwise, I would be thrilled to hear from you in the comments. However, according to many ancient scholars, in the absence of any text explicitly describing what happens, nothing happens in this situation. But I'm here to give you an alternative option.
Now, let's not all panic at once.
We already know that if a creature lands after falling 10 feet or more, it suffers 1d6 bludgeoning damage for every 10 feet that it traveled to a maximum of 20d6 damage, and that it will fall prone unless it finds some way to avoid the damage. So that's what happens when you fall, but what if there's another creature in the space where you would have landed? It seems like an oversight in the rules that this situation was never described. So I propose the following solution. If the falling creature lands in a space occupied by another creature, that creature also suffers the same damage. The stationary creature should be allowed a dexterity saving throw, DC 8 plus the number of tiles the creature fell, for a minimum DC of 10. In the case of a successful save, the stationary creature steps deftly into an adjacent tile and the falling creature falls to the floor instead. Having to write a rule to explain what happens when a falling creature collides with another creature made me realize that I actually liked this rule, and so did the players at my table. We started applying it to other situations where creatures had involuntarily moved 10 feet or more. And that's pretty much it. It's a very simple rule, but when I explain it to people, it tends to open up some very old arguments about the nature of D&D itself. That's why I feel in order to properly talk about it, I need to discuss and defend customizing the rules in general. And just so you know, all of the rules that I'm going to be talking about today are going to be available in a very handy PDF in the description. Special thanks to Homebrewery for making an amazing program that you can use, that anyone can use for free to make their own mock-up D&D rules. So the first argument that I'm used to hearing when I suggest this rule or any other one like it is why? Why modify the rules? Why do we even need this?
Oh, let's all ask each other. That'll solve this problem.
And this is a very reasonable argument, actually. It's probably the most reasonable argument that I'm going to talk about today. In short, the rules are there for a reason. They're there to make the game objective and fair, and I definitely agree that a DM shouldn't go around carelessly messing with that pre-existing paradigm of fairness. D&D is already a very nebulous game with tons of different interacting features, all of which have been carefully balanced over decades of testing and multiple iterations of the rules. Modifying those rules creates an opportunity for a player to be confused that wouldn't have otherwise existed. Using the rules exactly as written makes sure that everyone is on an even playing field. But conversely, players can also feel cheated when the rules fail to account for their cool, spontaneous idea. And that's why the DM is empowered to change those rules as needed. This passage on the first page of the DMG feels especially relevant. As a storyteller, the DM helps the other players visualize what's happening around them, improvising when the adventurers do something or go somewhere unexpected. As an actor, the DM plays the roles of the monsters and supporting characters, breathing life into them. As a referee, the DM interprets the rules and decides when to abide by them and when to change them. Really, at its core, editing the rules is one of the most entertaining and essential features of tabletop RPGs. It's one of the fundamental aspects which separates them from other mediums of entertainment. 5th edition itself seems to be written with the implicit understanding that players are already doing this and need to do it in general in order to make the game playable. It's true that this can get out of hand sometimes. I find that new DMs especially have a bad habit of ignoring or even encouraging power creep when they customize rules, but editing the rules itself is still a fundamental part of the game.
So it's all come down to this. A dungeon and dragons.
I didn't see it coming.
This leads to the second criticism that I'm used to hearing, which is, It seems unfair that a creature being pushed through the environment might deal damage to my character with no chance of reprieve. And this criticism is fundamentally less compelling than the first, because there are many things in D&D that can happen to your character without any chance of reprieve. This is really not the worst example. A very small percentage of builds can actually push a creature to a distance where it will take more than 1d6 damage from this rule. You'll probably need to be able to cast 3rd level spells just to do as much as 2d6 extra damage. If you were running a game with lots of homebrewed abilities, like powerful telekinetic push effects that regularly reached 30 feet or more, I might find this criticism a bit more legitimate. But the truth is that a push of more than 10 feet is extremely unlikely in almost every case. It feels kind of pointless to rule out the possibility of collision damage altogether on the basis that an extra d6 of damage here and there is going to break the game. Characters have to be somewhat fragile and vulnerable for their successes to mean anything. If you were guaranteed to survive every encounter, then winning an encounter would be pointless. Risk is what makes the game rewarding. On the other hand, when something is not accounted for in the rules, that can be deeply unsatisfying for everyone at the table. Even I have had this experience when sitting on the other side of the DM screen. It just isn't very fun when you want to do something that feels reasonable but the game rules say it's impossible, or they ignore it altogether. And that typically leads to the third area of criticism that I'm used to entertaining, which is that in the physical world, being pushed into a wall or another object isn't mechanically similar to falling, and it shouldn't be modeled the same way in D&D. Which is true, but as an argument it's not that great. There's a very old response to it. D&D isn't a physics engine. There are many things in the game that don't make sense in the first place. Falling damage is actually a really great example of something that doesn't follow real-world physics. If I had tried explaining D&D fall damage to a physics teacher in high school, I probably would have gotten yelled at. In the real world, falls are incredibly dangerous. I used to work at heights for many years, and I received government-mandated safety training that told me that falls from around 9 meters, which is roughly 21 feet, are considered pretty much absolutely deadly, with virtually no chance of survival. So, falling from a height of greater than 9 meters doesn't make the fall more deadly, it just makes the splash zone larger. Similarly, a fall of less than 10 feet can't actually damage you in D&D, but short falls can absolutely kill a person in real life. So it's not as though fall damage makes sense in the first place. It doesn't follow real-world physics. That's not really what its purpose is. Instead, it makes mechanical sense. It provides a variable hazard that the DM can use to introduce predictable obstacles to the party. Great heights create boundaries that are not impassable, but which require a certain level of calculated risk on behalf of the players. The same rationale applies to using fall mechanics for collision damage. It gives the players an objective way to measure the risk involved with that kind of hazard, even if it would get me kicked out of AP Physics. And that leads to the final area of criticism that we're going to talk about today, which is that bigger and smaller creatures shouldn't be equally easy to move around the environment. Okay, so essentially, my small character or my large character shouldn't take as much damage from being pushed around the environment or from falling, maybe, as other characters do. And this is actually a much better physics-based criticism, but it's still not super convincing, but the reason that it's better is that it's not just about realism, it's about balancing play. It's about balancing the game mechanically. Playing a large or small character changes a number of important things about the game. Neither one, being large or small, is exclusively a drawback nor an advantage. Instead, they each have their own advantages and disadvantages. Examples given in the rules apply to things like carrying capacity, equipment size, and even fundamental game statistics like armor class. So it does seem like this criticism describes a problem which requires a mechanical solution. Therefore, I propose the following adjustments. Small and tiny creatures suffer 1d8 damage instead of 1d6, and they have disadvantage on saves against push effects, whereas large and huge creatures suffer 1d4 damage instead of 1d6, and enjoy advantage on saves against those effects. But I realize that the solution does favor the large creatures a little bit, and so in order to offset that, I switch the relationship, the advantage-disadvantage relationship, and the greater and lesser damage relationship when rolling for fall damage and in order to avoid collisions. So, large creatures, advantage on push saves, but disadvantage on saves to avoid collisions. Small creatures, advantage on saves to avoid collisions, disadvantage on saves to avoid being pushed in the first place. And then large creatures take more damage from falling and less damage from pushing, whereas small creatures take less damage from falling and more damage from pushing. Again, this does not make sense according to real-world physics, but it does kind of make sense within the mechanics of balancing the game. Just as a final addendum here, creatures with powerful builds should not be considered large in this case. They should be considered medium. I feel strongly that totally making myself available to the criticism of my players is an essential part of running a game that feels as fair as it is fun to play. And so I don't mind going through these arguments, but if I tried to cover all of them, I'd just be here all day. So instead, I'll just leave you with some of my final thoughts on DMing in general. I almost exclusively set my campaigns in standard settings like Faerun or Eberron, and players at my table are allowed access to any in-world content from those settings, provided they can give me a valid source. I rarely make new monsters. It's my conviction that if you feel the need to make new monsters to keep your games exciting, you probably haven't spent enough time looking through the existing ones and exploring their variant forms and the expanded lore. By all means, feel free to make new monsters for the sake of story or art, to be creative or just for fun, but what I'm trying to say here is that you don't need to do it to make the game more challenging. While there are some very helpful rules for making monsters in the DMG, I find that most DMs basically ignore them and just make whatever feels right at the moment. That is okay if your creature has some purpose other than being mechanically different from the existing monsters, but it very often results in power creep, especially when you're trying to make a monster that's specifically going to challenge your party. If I do make monsters, I always follow the exact rules in the DMG to the letter, and this has become a little bit of a tangent, but I never make new classes. I do build a lot of unique content, magic items, NPCs, sometimes even new archetypes. I like making backgrounds and races, but everything I make follows the exact explicit guidelines for creating those things that are set out in the core rules and now in Tash's guide. Why am I saying all of this? Well, it's my conviction that my D&D games are played according to the rules as written, in spite of having a fair amount of custom content like this collision rule. That's important to me because I feel that it's important for everyone at the table to have access to the exact same game. That means that game has to be explicitly defined, has to have rules that everyone can read, have access to, understand, and most importantly to discuss. I don't think I'm capable of simply modifying the rules at a whim and still offering a fair experience as a DM. And that's why I work so hard at balancing the new content I create, and I always make sure that the additional rules are discussed and agreed upon ahead of time, and I always make sure that my players approve of my choices. Personally, I draw a distinction between tweaking the rules here and there as needed versus editorializing the game to the point where it's a different experience altogether. That's what gives me the confidence to say that my games are still played according to the rules as written. Anyway, this has definitely gone a lot longer than I ever intended it to go. Thanks so much for tuning in, and please stay tuned for more content like this because I am not done.